Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial. It is October, which is the month of Halloween, and as I was trying to record this video, all sorts of weird things started happening. The camera was failing, suddenly the power went out, and now I don't even know where I am anymore. And quite honestly, it's just a little bit spooky. But in this tutorial, I really want to show you how to use Adobe After Effects to create all sorts of digital noise, glitch, and other disturbing video effects without using any third-party plugins. This is going to be an intermediate tutorial, and I will assume that you are fairly comfortable using Adobe After Effects. But even if you're just getting into it, as long as you have some tenacity, you'll probably be okay following along. But now, before anything else bad has a chance to happen, let's jump right into the tutorial. Uh-oh. Welcome to the wonderful world of Adobe After Effects, and as always we are going to start out with an empty composition. First, let's grab the footage for this tutorial called spooky.mp4, and as always you'll find a download link to this file in the description of the video. Let's grab this clip and drop it into our composition. And this is just a really short clip from the intro to this tutorial. Let me actually just disable the audio on this layer because I don't want to hear me talk while you hear me talk. Also, because our composition is a little bit too long, let's just go to the end of our layer, press N to trim down our work area, simply right click onto this header and say trim comp to work area, and now we're all set up to go. In case you're not too familiar, every video layer consists of multiple different color tracks. Usually a video will have a red, green and blue channel, as well as an alpha or a transparency channel. In Adobe After Effects, you can actually visualize these individual channels. At the bottom of your preview window, there's these little three colored dots. You can click on this little drop down here and say, show me only the red channel. And this is essentially the red information, but displayed in grayscale, or the green channel, the blue channel, or the transparency, and it's fully opaque, so there's nothing in that one. Or you can show the RGB of the video. The first effect I want to show you is this really cool displacement where the different color channels of the video are being displaced and kind of offset, like there's actually a digital glitch in the signal of your video. In order to do that with our plugins, we first need to split our video, which contains a red, green and blue channel, into separate layers, one for every color. So let me retain this base footage, press Ctrl D to duplicate it, and let's rename this layer to red. Then come over into your Effects and Presets panel and search for the Shift Channels effect. Let's apply this effect to our layer, and in the effect settings for the Shift Channels effect, you can determine which channels takes information from which color channel of your video. You can turn them on or off at will. And what I want to do with this particular layer, I'm going to leave the alpha as from alpha, that's fine. Take red from red. But I'm going to go take green from, I'm going to change this to fully off, so don't take any green information out of this video. It's now going to go purple because we're only taking the red and the blue channel out of the video. I'm also going to disable the blue channels and turn that to full off. And now this video layer is really just the red information of our video. Let's duplicate this layer and let's call this one green. Come up in the effect settings for the Shift Channels effect. Let's disable our red as well, and it's going to go to black because we no longer pull in any color information from our source video. But now let's go take green from, and let's change this over to green. So this is now just our green channel. Let's again duplicate this layer one more time and rename this one to blue. This time I'm going to disable take green from full off and take blue from blue. So now this is our blue channel. Well, that's all great, but we now need to essentially reassemble these layers. For that, let's press F4 to enable the layer switches, and I'm going to disable the visibility on my spooky MP4 base layer. I'm just keeping this around for reference. This is essentially the full video track. Actually, maybe I'll just delete it to just make it a little bit less confusing. So let's delete the bottom layer. So now what we have is we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. Now, in order to reassemble our original video, we can simply change the blend mode of the green and the blue channel. And the way it actually works in After Effects and Premiere Pro, these channels are additive. They're being added together to give you the final output. So now let's leave red on normal, select the green layer, and well, actually, let me disable the blue layer. So now this is the green layer, and let's change the blend mode from normal over to add. So now we're actually adding the green layer on top of the red layer, and it's kind of gone a little bit yellow, but it looks a little bit more natural already. And let's enable the blue layer and change the blend mode from normal over to add. Cool, so we're essentially back to where we started, and if you scrub through your composition, it'll look like you just had the basic base footage sitting in there. However, because we've now split our video out into a red, green and blue channel and layer, you can move these layers around independently. So let's select the green layer, let's just drag it around a little bit. And here you can see the effect we're going to create. You can kind of offset these channels to create this really weird but very interesting and organic looking glitch effect, kind of like analog noise, as if your signal coming into your TV or your computer, if you're watching on YouTube, is kind of being distorted, and so the channels are just being offset or jittered or not transmitted correctly. This looks pretty cool already. If you animate this effect, you can get this really cool and organic looking digital noise effect on your video, so let's do that. But before we get to adding the animation, as well as all of the animation controls, you may notice that you can see these weird borders around the edges, and that's just because, well, our layers don't extend past their natural size, so you're getting these weird borders. But that's really easy to fix up, so let's make sure we set that up first. For that, just select any of the layers. Let's just take the blue layer at first and search for and apply the motion tile effect. In the settings for the motion tile effect, just jack up the output width so it's past 100%, so you're kind of essentially extending this layer outwards. 500 is probably a bit much, maybe we'll go 200 by 200, and I'm also going to enable mirror edges. Obviously, this is going to mirror the information. If I'm temporarily switching this back to normal blend mode, you can see that I'm kind of getting this weird mirrored effect, but if you're just jiggling the layer around a little bit, these duplicated edges are just not going to be that obvious, and without mirror edges you're getting these really harsh borders, so make sure you enable mirror edges on that. And let's change the blend mode of this blue layer back to add, and let's simply select the motion tile effect, Ctrl+C to copy it, and paste it onto your green and onto your red channels. And now, even though we're moving these layers around, those really ugly kind of stand out edges are just gone. Let's start adding the animation, and I first want to reset all of my layers so they're nicely positioned in the center of my composition. So let's simply select all of the layers and press Ctrl, Alt and F to snap them all back right to where they belong. And now you have multiple options. You can reveal the position property of your layers and add keyframes and kind of move these around individually. But I actually prefer to have a central place where I can control all of my animation, especially when you're working with effects that kind of span multiple layers. So let's collapse all of them again. Let's instead create a new solid layer. I'm going to call this layer control, all caps, because it's not going to be actually visible. We're just going to add some expression controls to it. Hit OK. Let's hide the layer. And let's come into the Effects and Presets panel, and let's search for the slider control. I have talked about expression controls in a separate tutorial. They're just useful for managing and controlling your expressions in After Effects and your animations. Again, link in the description of the video if you want to know more. Let's simply add the slider control to our control layer and select the effect in your Effects and Controls panel. Press Enter to rename it. And I'm going to call this one RGB Split Amount. I'm going to use this slider to control the overall amount of RGB split that I'll see. So I can kind of keyframe this to come in and out whenever I want to add a little bit of that interesting RGB signal noise effect. In order to create the actual noise effect, we are going to be using a wiggle expression. And for that, I do want to add 2 additional slider controls. So let's add one more slider control to our control layer. This one I'm going to call RGB Split Frequency. And you can simply duplicate it in your effects panel. Let's duplicate this slider control, and this one I'm going to call RGB Split Amplitude. And I'm going to link these slider controls to expressions on the position property for my blue, green and red layers. And I can then control all of the animations from this one place, from this one layer, and it just makes it a whole lot easier to manage, especially if you do end up adding more layers. But of course, feel free to simply animate the position of all of these layers around in any way you want if you just want to achieve the effect nice and easy. But I assume you're here for a reason, and hopefully you'll find the way we're going to be doing it useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and select my red layer in my composition, press P to reveal the position property, hold down Alt on your keyboard and click on the stopwatch icon to add an expression to this position property. And in the expression editor that open up in your timeline, simply type wiggle, open round bracket. And now I actually want to select some of these sliders that I've added to my control layer. So let's reselect the control layer. And yes, After Effects is going to complain a little bit because we haven't finished our expression just yet. So let's simply re-click into this expression. make sure you're at the very end after the opening round bracket for wiggle. Take the pick whip icon and drag it onto the slider value for the RGB split amount slider to insert that into the expression. This is quite lengthy, but it's really just referencing this composition, the control layer, the RGB split amount effect, and then the slider out of that. So that's just the value of the slider. Space, or you can leave out the space as well. Star for multiply. Again, yes, use the pick whip icon and make sure your cursor is still at the end of your expression. Pick whip, and this time we're going to pick the frequency. Let go. Comma, and this is getting a little bit small, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drag this down just a little bit so we can see the full expression. Otherwise this is going to be a bit hard to see. Again, make sure you're at the end of the expression, pick whip the amount again, and star, and this time I'm going to pick whip the amplitude and a round bracket at the end. And let's click outside of the expression editor. The error should go away. And if you scrub through right now, nothing at all exciting will happen because we haven't actually animated our sliders yet. Now, this does look pretty horrible. You could probably clean this up a little bit, but it'll do for now. It's essentially just applying a wiggle expression using the values of our RGB split amount multiplied by the frequency and our RGB amount multiplied by the amplitude. So I can control the frequency and the amplitude of this effect separately from the overall amount of RGB split in general. But before I start adding keyframes, let's come down into our red channel. In the position property, click into the expression editor. Make sure everything's selected, or you can go Ctrl-A to select the whole expression, Ctrl-C to copy it. Now go into the green layer, press P, Alt, and click onto the stopwatch icon to add an expression and just paste that whole thing in there. That's cool. Select the blue layer, P, Alt onto the stopwatch icon, and just Ctrl-V to paste the expression in there. So now we have the same expression on all of these position properties for our 3 layers. Let's come into the control layer. Let's go to maybe about 1 second. Click on the stopwatch icon for the slider. So we're starting it out at 0. Go to maybe 1.5 seconds. Let's jack this up to 1. Let's go to about 2 seconds and let's lower this back to 0. With the control layer selected, you can press U to reveal all of the keyframes, and there are 3 keyframes on the slider for our RGB split amount. But again, absolutely nothing is happening, and that is because we haven't actually given this effect any frequency, which is how often it occurs per second, or an amplitude in how many pixels each of these layers is being displaced. So if we now, again, my cursor is kind of already on 1.5 seconds where my amount slider is 1. If I now increase the amplitude, you can see now these layers are being shifted off. I can also jack up the frequency. So maybe I'll set the frequency to maybe about 14 or 15, somewhere around there. Feel free to play with this in any way that you want. And I'm maybe going to leave the amount on maybe about 20 or so. Let's simply rewind and let's play this effect back. That looks pretty cool. Now, I think the amplitude is a little bit too strong, so maybe I'll just lower this a little bit. And I hope you can appreciate why I took the amplitude and frequency out of the amount. So the amount is really the overall effect, because what I can do now, I can kind of come in a little bit later to maybe about 3 seconds. And again, just animate this to 1, come down a little bit, set that to 0. I'm really just adding more keyframes to the amount slider at the top, and that kind of controls the entire effect. So I can kind of have it happen at different times and with different intensities, and I can alter the frequency or the amplitude as well. Well, maybe I'll make this a little bit stronger and set the amount to 2, so I get a really strong RGB split at the end, and then just a small one at the beginning. And you can tweak this in any way you want, but this is essentially how you create an RGB split digital glitch effect without using any third-party plugins. Cool, so what now? Let's add some other digital glitch effects to our video. Let's just select all of our layers and press U to collapse them all. And what I want to do is I want to add like a pixelated distortion. Like I think I've seen it in Watch Dogs, where you can kind of get this pixelated image, like this blocky compression error issue that kind of looks like, bad compressed video, or you downloaded something off the internet and the file is just a little bit busted. It plays back, but it's kind of blocky and weird. So let's add that effect next. For that, we're going to use the displacement map effect, but the displacement map effect actually needs a pattern as an input to determine what gets displaced and how. So what I want to create first is just a really rough pixel map, like a square pixel block texture that I can then use to display and distort all or part of my footage. So for that, let's create a new solid layer. I'm going to call this layer Pixels. And then let's search for and apply a turbulent noise effect. Next, let's also apply a mosaic effect. And the mosaic effect essentially just turns your image into rough pixels. And you can increase the horizontal block count and vertical block count to add a few more pixels. So maybe I'll go 20, 20. Do note that the pixels aren't square simply because my composition resolution is 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is an aspect ratio of 16 by 9. So if you wanted square pixels, you could jack this up to a multiple of 16. So 32 by 18, for example, would give you square pixels. I do kind of like the slightly elongated look though, so I'm going to leave that. And let's just jack up the contrast on the turbulent noise effect. So we're getting fairly harsh looking pixels. And finally, just to give it a little bit more life, if you scrub through right now, all of that is very static. So hold down Alt and click onto the stopwatch icon next to the evolution property to add an expression. I'm simply going to type in time star. Maybe we'll go with 1000. I want this to change through quite quickly. And now if I scrub through, you can see our noise, or pixel noise, just shifts really, really nice and quick. And we're going to use this to displace our actual footage. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to pre-compose the pixels layer. So select it, Ctrl Shift and C to pre-compose. Let's call this layer Pixels Comp and make sure that you move all attributes into the new composition. So all of these effects get nested inside the composition. Otherwise, the displacement map effect won't work properly. So let's hit OK. And we can disable the visibility because we don't actually need to see this layer. And I'm also going to drag it to the very bottom just so it's out of the way. Next, you can either apply a displacement map to your red, green, blue channels separately or independently in any way you want. But one thing I find much more flexible is just using an adjustment layer because I can then apply it to everything as well if I really wanted to. So let's right click into our layers, come up here and select a new adjustment layer. Let's rename this layer to compression glitches. Let me make this panel just a little bit bigger so I can see what's going on. And let's search for and apply the displacement map effect. In the settings for the displacement map effect, change your displacement map layer from your current composition over to the pixels comp because that's the one we want to use to actually displace our image, which is our pixelated map or our pixel pattern. And now you can actually increase the max horizontal displacement and the maximum vertical displacement to kind of shift your video off. You're kind of getting this really weirdly distorted effect. And because we have animated this noise pattern, if you scrub through, you'll actually see this change. It kind of shifts and drifts and just changes through a little bit, gives you this really weird undulating noise effect. And I'm finding this almost a little bit too organic. It's not changing through quickly enough for me. So I'm going to jump back into my pixels comp, onto my pixels layer. And what I might do, I might actually jack up the contrast just a little bit more. And on this evolution property, let's press U on the pixels layer to reveal all of the expressions. Maybe I'll jack this up to 5000. I really want this to change through almost every frame. That looks actually pretty good. Maybe I'll make this just a little bit darker, so I have a little bit less displacement happening, and jack up the contrast just a little bit more. But again, feel free to tweak this in any way you want. This is essentially just the pattern that gets applied to displace your original image. So let's jump back into the tutorial. Let's scrub through and play this back. Yep, and it looks really, really noisy, but also because we're not controlling when this effect comes in and out. And yes, you could either animate the horizontal displacement and the vertical displacement in your displacement map effect. You could also animate the opacity of this compression glitches adjustment layer because that controls how much of this effect gets applied. But when you're using displacement effects, I try to avoid that because it gives you this really weird blended, blurry feel when you're trying to do it via the opacity of the adjustment layer. So I'm going to use the displacement, but I'm not going to control them here. So I'm going to reset them to 0 in the displacement map effect itself. And instead, like good citizen, let's come back to our control layer and let's just add a few more slider controls to control that digital displacement map. So let's search for and apply a few more slider controls to our layer. The first one I'm going to call compression amount. Let's just duplicate the slider, rename the second to compression vertical, and duplicate again, and let's call this one compression horizontal. And just because I'm anal and because that's the order they are in the displacement effect, let's just reorder these to be horizontal and vertical in that order. Let's reselect our compression glitches adjustment layer, and in the displacement map effect, hold down Alt and click on max horizontal displacement to add an expression to that property. And again, let's link those sliders to this effect. I'm going to reselect my control layer and Surprisingly, After Effects didn't complain this time, because everything is still okay. Let's reselect our expression, clear out everything that's in here, and what I want to enter into my max horizontal displacement expression, let's use the pick whip icon and select compression amount, star, so multiply that by pick whip icon, the horizontal compression slider value, and click outside, so that's fine. Let's come back onto the compression glitches layer and alt click onto the max vertical displacement. And same thing, let's reselect our control layer, clear out everything in our vertical displacement expression, and let's pick whip the compression amount as the first one, star, so multiply that by the compression vertical. So let's enter that into the expression. So now we're essentially controlling the horizontal and vertical displacement of this displacement map effect with these slider controls that we have on our controls layer, so we don't need to go into here anymore, kind of get out of that. And now what I want to do, we already have this cool RGB split at around 1.5 seconds. So let's come down to 1 second, add a keyframe onto my compression amount, go forward to about 1.5 seconds. Maybe we'll set this up to 1 as well and come to 2 seconds. Let's lower that down to 0. And if you press U to reveal your keyframes, you can now see we have keyframes on our compression amount slider control, but obviously there's nothing happening yet because our horizontal and vertical compression are still set to 0. So let me just jack these up a little bit, maybe around 100, maybe vertical just a little bit, maybe 50, 60. And again, just tweak this in any way that you want. So now what we're getting, if you come back and play this back, well, it's probably a little bit too strong to be honest. So maybe I'll lower this. I just want a little bit of this weird displacement happening, and maybe I'll have it a little bit quicker as well, maybe a little bit more towards the end. But again, feel free to tweak this in any way you want. So kind of just have it happen here just a little bit, get that digital displacement happening. And now one of the things I want to do is I actually don't want to apply this compression glitches to all 3 layers at once, because while it does look kind of cool, it doesn't look like a compression artifact just yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drag my compression glitches adjustment layer. Right now it applies to the blue, green and red channels. Let's drag this down to only apply it to the red and green channels. And that's kind of a cool effect. But I think I might actually drag this one further down so this displacement, this square blocky displacement only happens on the red channel. So let's drag this down just above the red channel. And now what I'm getting, can you see these really red blocky artifacts that are happening around the outside? That actually looks much cooler. I really like this. It's a little bit more subtle, but it really looks like a compression artifact. In fact, I might actually go back to my control layer and jack up the horizontal and vertical displacement a little bit more to make it a little bit more obvious again. So that kind of looks really cool. So just as a noise effect. And again, you could reshuffle your layers if you wanted to and apply it to the green channel instead or just the blue channel. Feel free to tweak this. I'm just kind of hopefully just giving you the building blocks of how to create these sorts of effects in Adobe After Effects. So let's just play this effect back. Cool, that looks really nice. Finally, the last thing I want to cover is how to add some tearing into the video, like again, like a digital effect that I think I've seen on CSI. I think where you get that really weird blocky digital tearing of the video, like some part is being transmitted earlier than another. So again, not too difficult to add. Let's go back into our project panel and we're going to reuse this pixels comp, but I don't actually want to reuse the exact same layer and I don't want to change this because I actually like how this compression artifact looks and I don't want to touch it. Very happy with that. So let's simply duplicate the pixels comp in our project panel. Let's call this one lines comp. Let's jump into it, reselect our pixels layer. Maybe I'll rename this to lines as well. And come into the effects controls for our lines. Turbulent noise can stay as it is. Now my horizontal blocks, I actually want to change that to 1 because I really just want lines. I want lines going across. Maybe I'll add a few more vertical blocks. So maybe I'll add this up to 30. And I want to enable sharp colors on my mosaic because right now these are actually quite soft. So let's set this to sharp colors. So that gives me really harsh, maybe a bit too bright actually. I want just a few of those. Maybe I'll just lower the contrast a little bit and a little bit darker. I just want a few lines. I don't want too many. So I think that looks all right. So we'll use these lines for horizontal displacement, kind of just tearing up our video layer. Let's return to our tutorial composition. Let's go to the project panel and let's drop our lines comp into our tutorial composition. Again, disable the visibility, you won't actually need to see it. Now, you can either create a new adjustment layer, or you can be lazy like me and simply duplicate the compression glitches adjustment layer we already have. Let's drag this to the very top, just underneath the control layer, because I do want this to affect my blue, green, and red channel. Let's rename this one to horizontal tears, come into the effects controls, and in the displacement map effect, let's change the displacement map layer, which is still set to pixels, to our lines comp. So now we're getting these horizontal streaks or tears going on in our video. And obviously we need to tweak these expressions as well. But first, again, like a good citizen, let's come back to our control layer and add some more slider controls first. So again, let's just either add them from the effects and controls panel or just duplicate one that's already there. I always like starting with the clean one. I do not know why. Let's rename this one to tearing amount. And again, this is going to be the master controlling the horizontal and vertical tearing. Let's duplicate it and rename this one to tearing horizontal, and duplicate one more time, and this one's going to be our tearing vertical. Let's reselect our horizontal tears adjustment layer, press UU to reveal all of the expressions. Let me just make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. I'm just going to drag these panels down so we can actually see the full extent of our expressions. And you can either change the names of the sliders that are being referenced, but it might be easier to just clear them out and recreate them. So here I've got my effect properties. Let's reselect our control layer so we can see all of our sliders. Alt-click onto the max horizontal displacement property on our horizontal tears displacement map. So let's just Alt-click on that to add an expression. And again, let's reselect our control layer. Let's go back into the expression editor, clear that out, and pick whip the tearing amount, multiplied by the horizontal tearing. And let's alt-click onto the max vertical displacement, reselect our control layer. Let's clear that effect out. And this time I'm going to use tearing amount slider, multiply that by the tearing vertical. So now we should be all hooked up. And again, you can add this effect at any point of time in your video. Let me just select my control layer, press U to reveal all of the keyframes. So right now we're only animating the compression amount and the RGB split amount. So maybe before we even get into this twitching, I'll add some horizontal tearing so you can see what that looks like. So let's set a keyframe on our tearing amount slider for about half a second. So maybe by about a second, let's jack this up to 1. And maybe just before 2 seconds, let's lower that back to 0. Press U on your keyboard twice so you can see all of the keyframes plus the ones that we've just added. And let's just increase the horizontal tearing amount. So we're kind of just horizontally tearing those two videos apart. And vertical, I don't actually want to go too strong on the vertical. So maybe just a few pixels on the vertical. So now what this looks like. So you're kind of getting this kind of weird effect. Now this is way too much. This is way too long as well. So maybe I'll lower this amount to just about 50, and I'm going to bring in these keyframes. I think I really just want this effect to appear very, very shortly. Just for a moment there, I'll just get some vertical tearing happening just about there. That looks about all right. Pretty cool. Now you can add other effects like glows. You can add a time remapping effect and add wiggles so you kind of get stuttering in your video as well. There's a whole bunch of other cool things you can do, but hopefully this gives you a basic understanding of how to create all sorts of glitch and digital noise and other disturbing video effects, all very much based on this digital distortion kind of theme, but hopefully you found this useful. Now, finally, let's make our preview window a little bit bigger. Let's collapse all of our layers again. Go back to the beginning of your composition and play back your final digital glitches effect. And that's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this video and you want to help me out, please hit that like button or consider subscribing if you're new. And as always, if you do have any comments, questions, or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.